Today, we're going to be talking about consciousness and dreams. Dreams, boy. Actually, these subjects are really some of my favorite. So let's get to it. First of all, what is consciousness? Everyone has a sense of what it means, but there's a famous, I don't know whether he's a philosopher, but I think he's a philosopher. His last name is Chalmers. Can't recall his first name at this point. I really should I should put that in my notes so that next time I do this I can mention his name. But he talks about the hard problem. He talks about the whole sense of how humans work. Most of the kinds of things that he's talking about are our ability to have logic and make decisions, and our ability for our bodies to work, etc., etc. Those are all what, I guess by implication, he considers to be easy problems. The hard problem is, how do you take matter in the form of living cells, assemble them all into a human body, and have them create consciousness? Well, he referred to that as the hard problem, is that leap that goes from a sort of inert biological robot into a creature that has self-awareness or consciousness. Making that leap is the hard problem, meaning it's almost impossible to explain. Not only impossible to explain, but impossible to discover how it happens. So anyways, let's talk about the hard problem for a minute. Let's talk about consciousness. Let's talk about what conscious is, first of all. As I said, there's lots of different ways to define it, I suppose, and I don't think anyone's really put their finger on exactly what it is, but here's how I would describe it. It's our sense of being. It's our sense of existence. Some people refer to it as the seat of yourself. It's all the place where emotions and thoughts arise from. It's the source of imagination and intuition. It's everything you feel that isn't automated. Everyone has a sense that they exist. Everyone has a sense that they're here and having an experience. And what consciousness is that sense. It's that core at the center of everything, that core thing in you that makes you feel like you're a person and that you're alive and that you exist. In some ways, some philosophers have said, it's the only thing that you can actually really know. It's the only thing that you can put your finger on and be 100% sure of. You can't really be sure of anything else. You can't be sure that you're a human living in a physical world. Maybe you're a simulation, and there literally are people who believe that, and these are reasonable, thoughtful people, not nutbags. And we may end up touching, I'm sure we're going to end up touching that on that eventually, but there really are people who are thinking that theoretically maybe we don't even exist as material, as that we exist in essentially as a simulation in a computer. And they give a lot of evidence to support that theory. And honestly, I can't prove they're wrong. Nobody can, because you can simulate everything with a powerful enough computer. So, to get back to the point at hand, the only thing you really, really do know, you may not be able to be absolutely 100% sure that you're even physical. You may not be able to prove that you're not running as a simulation in a computer. But one thing you can be certain of is that you have a sense of being and that you exist and that you're having an experience. That's what consciousness is. Okay? So that's I think as closely as I can define it. Now, I also used the word in the last few minutes, I think, awareness. And consciousness and awareness are very similar things. I guess the difference, the way I would define them, is that consciousness is the sense that you have that you exist and that you're having an experience. Awareness is actually you can have various levels of awareness. You can have a lot of awareness, which means you're really in the moment and you're really sort of connected with whatever's going on. And maybe there are situations where you have minimal awareness. Maybe as you're drifting off to sleep, your awareness is a little bit less attuned. So awareness is more of a quantitative level of alertness, if you want to use a synonym, versus consciousness. And this, the opinions vary, but I would say consciousness never leaves you. Consciousness is something that you always have. It's just that sometimes you're very aware of that consciousness, and other times you're not. All right? So consciousness versus awareness. In these lectures, I'm going to talk less about what consciousness is, because honestly, no one has been able to define it all that well. So I think the definition I've just given you is a perfectly reasonable, acceptable definition for most people. So we're going to talk about less about what consciousness is and more about where it is. Not what it is, but where it is. And specifically whether it's part of your human body. Conventional science, I would say universally, almost without exception, believes that consciousness is a creation of the brain, and that the brain is so powerful that it can create a sense for you that you exist. And those same people, generally, I would say overwhelmingly so, believe that a powerful enough computer could probably have that same ability. Because for most conventional scientists, materialists, reductionists, their view is that consciousness is a function of the power of the processing unit that comprises you, and of course that's your brain. And yes, of course, the brain has been shown to be an extremely powerful computer. Whether or not it creates consciousness is still, I think, highly debatable, but according to most scientists, it's not debatable. And the primary reason most scientists believe that is because they have no alternative mechanism to point to that would create consciousness. So if you believe that we live in a completely material world, and you believe that consciousness is unique to each human being, well, then you must believe that consciousness somehow resides within your physical body. And there's really only one organ we have that has the complexity, as far as we can tell, that has the complexity to create consciousness. And that would be the brain. And so really, the reason most scientists get to the point of saying it's in the brain, it's really a process of elimination of where else could it be. That's going to be a fundamental part of all the work that we're doing over these few hours, is to really get to the bottom of that particular issue as to whether consciousness must be a part of the body or not. All right. So we're gonna uncover this secret. We're gonna uncover this layer by layer, bit by bit. And we've already talked a little bit about how humans can affect their world with something that seems to be completely non-material. In some completely non-material way, non-physical way, we're able to affect our world. And I think slowly but surely we'll uncover more and more about that sort of topic. And I think part of the process of uncovering those details will be to demonstrate that consciousness does not necessarily arise from the brain, and specifically does not arise from the brain. But we'll get there. So, a good place to start when talking about consciousness is to talk about dreams. Dreams are a very profound thing. It's funny because we spend a third of our lives dreaming or sleeping, and most of that time sleeping, or almost all of that time sleeping, we spend dreaming. So you'd think we would know more about dreams than we do. The fact is that dreams are still a pretty mysterious thing for most of us, and they're especially mysterious for material, the hard scientists or the hard sciences, because they're ethereal. They're hard to grasp. They're not material things. They're hard to analyze. If someone's sleeping and dreaming about playing with their dog, you can't tell that externally by any means whatsoever. You can look at their brain in various different ways, and you can see parts of their brain lighting up. You can see, physical activity seemingly taking place, but the muscles aren't moving. Those parts of the brain that you would be using to run and play with the dog seem to light up when you're dreaming about running and playing with the dog as well. As a matter of fact, a lot of material scientists would say they're indistinguishable. The brain activity when you're dreaming about an activity versus when you're actually participating in the activity during your waking time is pretty much indistinguishable. So that's interesting. And people, a lot of scientists would use that as a proof point for, look, your brain is doing certain things when you're running around playing with your dog, and when you're dreaming, your brain is doing those same things. And so your brain is involved in all these activities. Well, not sure that's good logic, but that's the sort of logic that's being used. So anyways, the dreaming process is pretty incredible. We're going to spend a little bit of time trying to understand the actual sort of process of dreaming, what the stages of dreaming are, and try to define a few terms. And then maybe we're going to dig a little deeper and look into what actually goes on while you're dreaming. And eventually we're going to get to lucid dreaming, which I think is a very, very interesting topic and is definitely worthy of your attention. But that'll take a few minutes to get to. What's the purpose of dreaming? Well, who knows what the purpose of dreaming is, but conventional scientists have essentially come to the conclusion that it's a rest and recuperative process, that our body needs physical rest, and so it needs to be shut down and become still for a while so that it can recuperate from injuries and do all the essential work that needs to be done to keep the body in good working order. So just like a car or a tractor or any other tool, it needs maintenance. And the argument is during those 8 hours while you're sleeping, your body is receiving the maintenance that it needs. Reasonable theory. Also, that there's a whole sort of mental psychological aspect of dreaming that is just as important as the physical recuperative process. And that is that, as basically the way it's stated, is that there's a lot of sort of organization that goes on in the brain while you're sleeping, especially with regard to short-term versus long-term memory. So you did all these things during the day. You had breakfast. You did the dishes. You drove to work. You stopped at a stoplight. You said hello to someone. You did all these things during the day, and all those things at the end of the day, a lot of those things, some more for some people than others. Some people will remember a lot of those details at the end of the day. Other people will remember less of those details. The point is, those are all short-term memories. A lot of those memories are not very meaningful, not very important for your survival or your long-term. Just long-term, they're just not necessary. Is it really important that you stop at 3 red lights on the way to work on, March 1st, 2006? Probably not. Now, so the argument goes that while you're asleep, your mind is sorting through all of those memories, all those short-term memories, and essentially sort of getting rid of a lot of the stuff that's unimportant and storing the stuff that is important in long-term memory. And that's a very sort of mechanized, almost computer science view of what's going on. And then when you wake up the next day, you've got all this short-term memory available that can be filled up again the next day, the next time you go through, this time 7 stoplights instead of 3. And I suppose for a material scientist, maybe that all makes sense. All sounds a bit too mechanized for me, but maybe that's the way it works, right? So, anyways, that's the sort of computer science version of how, or I shouldn't say computer science, the traditional science view of dreaming. And there's also a whole Freudian aspect of dreaming that gets into, you're resolving deep conflicts, and your subconscious and your conscious are, while you're dreaming, your subconscious has more control of the steering wheel. And so the things you're dreaming about are the things that your subconscious is worried about, concerned about, and the characters in your dream are all aspects of your subconscious, etc., etc. So there's all that as well. So a psychiatrist could probably talk ad infinitum about dreams and the importance of dreams. Okay, but so that's how it is viewed from a conventional science perspective, and a lot of those things may be true. But let's sort of stop there and let's talk a little bit about the actual process of dreaming, just so that we can agree on some terminology and some basic facts. Okay, so the facts are most people need to sleep somewhere between 7 and 9 hours a day. The average, when people talk about getting a good 8 hours worth of sleep, that's actually about right. That's the average of how long humans need to sleep. And you have a clock, an internal clock that knows when it's time to go to bed, when it's time to get up. A lot of that is substantially affected by sunlight. And of course, we have a 24-hour day, and the sun comes up at a certain time in the morning, sets at a certain time at night. It varies depending on the time of year, but that has a strong impact on when you're tired and want to go to sleep, and when you want to get up, and that affects hormone releases in your body, etc., etc. And we're not going to get into any of that. So, 8 hours is a good starting point. Let's talk about the actual process of dreaming. You lie down, you're tired, you lie down, you close your eyes. You don't just immediately go to sleep. Anyone who has ever slept, which is everybody, understands that there's really kind of a sequence of things that happens. And eventually you fall asleep, and then you eventually wake up, and oh yeah, occasionally I wake up in the middle of the night and I go to the bathroom, I have a sip of water, or do nothing, close my eyes and go back to sleep. How does it all work? Well, you actually dream in cycles. And there's a repeating cycle that happens multiple times a night that defines your sleep pattern. And this is true for most people. Yes, of course, there'll be exceptions. But for most people, people dream in a 90-minute cycle. So if you fall asleep at 9 o'clock, at 10:30, you will start a new dream cycle. And so everything we talk about in terms of the logistics of how one dreams really fits into that 90-minute period of time. And if you ever time this, if you were to ever wake up in the night and just take some notes, which I'm suggesting you do, and we'll get to that in a minute, you will find out that yes, in fact, at approximately 90-minute intervals, you do sort of wake up and then restart your dreaming. And I would say that there are some people who believe they don't even dream. And scientists will tell you that's not true. It's just that you don't remember that you dream. Speaking of which, put that on hold for a second. I wanted to make one comment about consciousness. Some people feel like at some points in time you are unconscious, such as dreaming. You actually become unconscious. I guess I just want to say here and now that I don't subscribe to that. I believe you're always conscious. You're simply more or less aware, and I talked about that before. But the one thing I didn't mention is, just to give an example, do you remember what you had for dinner on August 1st, 2015? My guess is no, you don't. Maybe you have it written down somewhere for some quirky reason, but you probably don't remember that. My question is, you don't remember it, but does that mean you were unconscious at the time? I think the answer is no. I probably wasn't not unconscious while I was eating my dinner. So my point being, just because you can't recall something during some period of time doesn't mean you're unconscious. It simply means that for one reason or another, that memory is not available to you right now. Maybe it's gone forever. Maybe it's still available, but you just don't know how to capture it. And we're going to talk a little bit about memories and whatnot in a bit, so we'll kind of leave that to the side. My point is, just because you can't remember it doesn't mean you were unconscious. All right? So let's get back into the sleep stage. So the first stage is you have a 90-minute cycle. The first stage, when you close your eyes, if you think about sleeping, there's a period of time when your eyes are closed and you're just sort of staring at the backs of your eyelids and you're just kind of thinking about things. Well, you're still awake at that point, so we're not going to call that a sleep phase. But at some point, your awareness is going to get a little bit hazy, and you're actually going to start seeing, or maybe it's not even that hazy, but you're going to start seeing shapes and patterns on the backs of your eyelids. You're going to actually start seeing swirling patterns and maybe some subtle colors. Very, very vague colors, though, nothing very bright. It's usually sort of a brown or a red or a green kind of tint to things. But you'll start seeing swirling. And eventually what happens is that swirling starts turning into patterns, in some cases geometric types of patterns. And over a period of time, those patterns will start taking forms like a car or a bus or a house or whatever. And that'll slowly formulate into some sort of a scene, and on you go with your dreaming process. That phase of sleep is called the hypnagogic phase. And the hypnagogic phase is that entry point to dreaming, and is that whole cycle of time when you're not quite asleep, but you are starting to see some hallucinogenic kinds of imagery. And you might even hear, very often someone will wake up with a start because they'll hear their name. And they'll look around and they'll realize no one actually said their name. That happens quite a bit. And so you can have an audio hallucination as well. And so it's usually a visual hallucination, and audio hallucinations happen during that hypnagogic stage. The next phase you go into is deep sleep. And I know everyone's heard of REM, and we're going to get to this in a minute, so don't worry, I'll talk about REM. But believe it or not, the next phase you go through from hypnagogic is into deep sleep. And deep sleep, you have a very, very low level of awareness. Again, material scientists would say you're unconscious at that time. I'm not so sure that's true. I'm not so sure there's any way they could prove that. They will look at brainwave patterns, and they'll say, theta versus alpha versus gamma. And, they'll talk about brainwave patterns, and they'll say, you're in this particular brainwave pattern, which means you're unconscious. And I just think those are arbitrary terms. Consciousness is too complex a topic to simply look at a brainwave pattern and decide that certain brainwave equates to being unconscious. Anyways, point is, yes, very low awareness or no awareness. So you'll go through this period of deep sleep. Then, after that deep sleep process, you will enter REM sleep. REM means rapid eye movement. That is the period, as most people realize, that's the period where you have what we would refer to as dreams. This whole process is a dreaming process, but that's where you have real dreams. That's where you have scenes. That's where you feel like you're in a situation. You're talking, you're walking, you're feeling, you're tasting, you're smelling, you're hearing, you're seeing. All of that happens during that phase of sleep, REM. And then the last is when you're coming out of REM, you go into a phase. It's very, very much like the hypnagogic stage, only this time it's called the hypnopompic stage. That is the stage, very similar to hypnagogic, where you're coming out of REM sleep and you're approaching being awake. And that's where you're sort of half awake, half asleep. And then, and we're going to get into a lot of these phases in a lot more detail, but then you're back into the awake mode, and then you'll drop back down into the hypnagogic stage, and you'll do that cycle again. You'll repeat that cycle. So that's a 90-minute cycle. And the way it works is, first of all, the way I kind of like to think of this, think of it as an elevator, okay? And so you start your elevator at the wake state, and the elevator starts going down. And you go down, and you pass through the hypnagogic phase, and you stay in that phase for various periods of time. It's a few minutes. Could be a couple of minutes. If you're extremely tired, you may only be in that hypnagogic state for a couple of minutes before you drop into deep sleep. I'm sure everyone has found that sometimes. They go to bed and they feel like they just instantly went to sleep. Well, you pass through that hypnagogic stage very quickly. And then other times you'll be in that hypnagogic stage for 10 minutes, 15 minutes. You could be in it an hour, I suppose, in some cases. But it's usually a few minutes. Then that elevator goes down, and it skips over. It goes right through REM. And sometimes you have a little bit of what you consider REM. It's like you feel like you're having a dream, very, very quickly after hypnagogic, but you drop through that phase very quickly, and you spend a lot of time in deep sleep. And your first couple of cycles, you're going to spend a tremendous amount of time in deep sleep, maybe an hour or more. That is where your body really needs that deep restorative rest. And so that's where you're going to stay, is in that deep sleep mode. And then the elevator is going to take you back up out of deep sleep and into REM. And you'll spend the first cycle or two of your night, you're going to spend a very small amount of time in REM, maybe only a few minutes, 5 minutes or something. And then you'll come up to hypnopompic. So the early stages, you will come down through hypnagogic and drop right through REM very quickly and spend most of your time in deep. And then you'll come back up into REM and spend a very short period of time, and then the hypnopompic. That's cycle 1, cycle 2. As you get deeper and deeper into the cycles, later and later in your night's sleep, you'll find that when you drop down from hypnagogic down into deep sleep, through REM and into deep sleep, you'll only spend just a few minutes in deep sleep. your body's been restored. You've done all the work necessary to really feel restored. Then you'll very, very quickly you'll come up, and then you'll spend the bulk of your time in REM. So first few phases, you just drop through REM and you spend most of your time in deep sleep, and then you spend time in REM on the way back out. So going down on the elevator, you don't really spend any time in REM. Coming back up in the elevator, you do. That's where you actually spend time in REM. So you can kind of think of it, if you want to think of it in terms of a cycle, it's a little bit different visual. Is that you got hypnagogic, deep sleep, REM, hypnopompic. And so you can kind of think of it in that kind of term as well. So there's just a little bit of mental imagery there. But that's really how it works. Now, although you may not remember waking up, you do. And in some cases, you'll go to hypnopompic on the way back out, and you'll just barely become awake, and then you'll drop back into hypnagogic. So you won't really become fully alert, open your eyes, and take that sip of water. In other cases, you will. So saying that you reach the awake state doesn't necessarily mean you get up and walk around the house. It simply means that you're back into a much more alert, non-sleeping state before you drop back in. All right, so you've got these cycles. What we find is that those first few cycles in the night, because you're spending most of your time in deep sleep, are somewhat not memorable in terms of dreams. The dreams are short, and they typically don't stick with you. They're not very vivid. During those later sleep cycles, especially the final sleep cycle, your dreams are quite vivid, quite extensive, and take up most of your cycle. I don't know if you've ever noticed, but usually those dreams that are very, 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 very vivid and very memorable typically happen in that last period of time before you get up in the morning. That's what's going on. That's why that's the case. Your deep sleep is no longer really being exercised. It's mostly the REM process that's being exercised. So it's not just that you wake up and went, wow, I had this unbelievable dream. It lasted so long. I wonder if that's been going on all night. No, it hasn't been. It's been going on the last approximately 90 minutes. And the reason it's so memorable is not because you just woke up in the morning and now you're remembering it. It's because it really was that much more vivid and had that much more awareness in it. Okay, just because it was a final sleep cycle. So that's really how it all works. I guess I wanted to talk about a couple of things. We talked about memories. We talked about unconsciousness for a minute. I want to talk about a dream that I had a couple of years ago. Well, you know what? I'm going to hold off and tell you. Before I tell you about the dream, I want to talk a little bit about sort of understanding dreams and sort of developing the skill of dreams, or the knowledge of dreams. The knowledge of dreams requires something very important, and that is that you remember your dream. And that's not an accidental thing. That doesn't just happen because it happens. It happens because you decide it's important and you work on it. It's actually a skill. And the most important thing that you can do to develop that skill, well, let me back up. Not only is it a skill, it's an important skill. And dreaming in general uncovers an amazing amount about your psyche, about your life in general, how you feel about things. I'm going to get into dream characters in a bit, but essentially any character in your dream represents some aspect of yourself. And so if you are able to understand your dreams better, you'll be able to understand yourself better. All right? And I'm not just saying that you get one of these dream books and go, what does it mean when you dream about being naked in public? What does it mean when you dream about you can't find your shoes? Whatever the thing may be. Yes, there are, go ahead and do that. That's interesting stuff, and it's probably mostly true. I'm talking about something a little more deep than that. I'm talking about understanding the actual characters in your dream, what they're saying, what they're feeling, what they're doing. Those are aspects of you. Those are aspects of how you feel about yourself and how you feel about others and how you feel about your life. So being able to remember this stuff is the first step in being able to understand it, look at it, analyze it, and learn from it. All right? So step one is remember the dream. How do you do that? Well, the most important thing you can do is take dreams seriously and keep a dream journal. Everybody I know, any author that I've ever read who's talked about the importance of dreams, step number one is journaling your dreams. And I'm not just talking about getting up in the morning and trying to remember what you can about your dreams. That's nice. That's huge. I'm talking about going really one step further and keeping that thing right on your bedside table. And when you wake up at 11 o'clock at night or 1 in the morning or 3 in the morning, if you remember some snippets of a dream, write them down. You're going to wake up anyways. So while you're awake, spend a couple minutes just writing down some of those thoughts. Close the book, go back to sleep. When you get up in the morning and you take a look at that little snippet, you'll remember that part, that piece of that dream. And so, really very important, keep a journal. And what you're going to find early on, you're only going to remember little bits and pieces of your dream. But over time, you're going to remember more and more as you go along. And that becomes so important for so many reasons. One is just the skill of being able to remember your dreams gets better as you exercise those muscles. Right? And so you're going to remember more and more about your dreams as you journal your dreams. Then the question, of course, is, well, why do I want to remember about those dreams? That, there's monsters there and they're always trying to kill me, and et cetera, et cetera. Maybe that's true, but you're going to be able to learn a lot from those dreams. By the way, just FYI, I haven't had a nightmare or a disturbing dream in probably 10 years. And I used to have dreams like that occasionally. And I'm really convinced that the more you come familiar with those internal parts of yourself, that part of your psyche, that part of your subconscious, the more you learn about that, the less frightening it is. And the more empowered you are. I mean, I find that a lot of scary dreams have to do with self-confidence and lack of empowerment, and lack of understanding, and fear. And I find all of those things change the more you learn about your dreams. So, just highly recommended. Also, the more you do this, the closer you'll get to be able to lucid dream. And I'm going to talk in a few minutes about lucid dreaming. It's pretty incredible. A couple other things about a couple of these phases, and then I'll tell you a story. One thing about the hypnopompic phase, that's the phase that you get into just before you wake up. It's a super, super creative period of time. And it's actually really an enjoyable period of time. You may remember, in sleeping, this is especially true in the morning, especially on a Saturday morning or a morning where you don't have the alarm clock buzzing in your ear, where you've got that sort of comfortable, almost a napping kind of a feeling, where you can kind of hear the birds outside, maybe you hear the dog shuffling by, maybe you hear your husband or wife downstairs making the coffee, whatever it might be, but you're also still asleep in some way. And you're in this sort of in-between state of sleeping versus waking. It's a very pleasant state. But beyond being pleasant, it's a super creative state. People like Einstein and Thomas Edison said that a lot of their most creative work was done in that phase just before waking up, that hypnopompic phase. I find that. I'm an electrical engineer, and I find through my entire career I've had very difficult problems at work trying to solve a particular engineering problem. And I've always found that during that period of time, that however many minutes it lasted. By the way, one of the cool things about the hypnopompic phase is you can stay in that phase almost indefinitely. You can kind of will yourself to stay in that phase and not to wake up. But I find myself being able to design circuits, design physical machinery, and imagine how it would work. I can visualize if I, design some sort of door opening mechanism. I could visualize how that mechanism worked. I could find where it was going to fail, how it was going to fail. I could make improvements and then visualize the improvement. I really found that it was almost like being able to prototype some of my designs and see how they're going to work without even waking up. So super creative period of time is that hypnopompic phase. Very, very, very valuable. So I guess the only other thing I'd want to mention in terms of these sort of traditional sleep phases, we talked about memories before. We talked about one of the aspects of sleep is this idea where you're kind of sorting through short-term memories and getting rid of them and taking some of those short-term memories and sticking them down into long-term memory. I'm not sure that that's actually how it works, because there's an implication there that says that a lot of your memories are lost. That 99% of all the things that have ever happened to you, all the things you've ever seen, all the things you've ever heard and said, 99% of that stuff is junk, it's unimportant, and is gone. And I agree that 99% of it is probably junk. I mean, who cares about what happened when you were sitting at that red light, right? A bird flew by, a dog walked by, a horn was honked. That's not important stuff. Maybe there was a certain song on the radio. Why do you need to remember that? And the answer is, well, you probably don't. But that doesn't mean you do forget it. Here's what I dreamt. I had a dream a couple of years ago, and I found this in my dream journal. So that was the importance of the dream journal, is that I was in third grade. And it was a typical day in third grade. Nothing really momentous happened on that day. We were sitting in a classroom, and the teacher was up there talking about whatever teachers talk about in third grade. I forget at this point. Although at the time, I was very, seemed very real, and the teacher was saying very real things, and my friends were my friends sitting there. I remember talking to one of my friends at recess during this dream, and we were talking about going over to his house to play that afternoon because it was a half day. And he was saying, oh yeah, well, I don't know if my mother's going to be around or not, and why don't you give me a call at whatever time, and we can decide whether you should get on your bike and come over. And as I was writing in the dream journal, I wrote down his phone number because it was still fresh in my mind. And what became apparent to me after having gone through this dream and written down the dream and thought about it a bit, I remembered everything in that dream. I remembered everybody's names. I remembered everybody's faces. I remembered what happened on that day. And I don't remember that exact day, objectively. I can't think what day that was, but I can say that I do remember the specific friends that I had, all their faces and all their names. I couldn't tell you right now probably more than one person's name in that classroom today as I sit and do this recording. But when I was in that dream, I knew everybody's name in that room, and I knew my friend's phone number. If you put a gun to my head right now, I couldn't tell you what that phone number was, but I can go to my dream journal and look it up, and I can tell you what the phone number is. So what's my point? My point is, I'm not so sure that you ever lose access to anything that's ever happened to you at any point in your life. I don't think it's accessible to you on a daily basis. But what I want to tell you is all that information is still intact, still as fresh as the day it happened, and it's just waiting for you to access it again. But you can only access it in certain states of mind. All right? I will also say that I don't believe for a second that although the brain is very powerful, I don't believe for a second it is powerful enough to keep track of every detail, of everything that's ever happened to you every second of your life. I don't believe that for a minute. It's just not it's not physically large enough to contain all of that information. If this information exists in some fashion, I'm convinced that it exists somewhere outside of your brain. Okay, but I'm skipping way, way ahead. We don't need to talk about that now. My point being, just want to let you know, all those things that you think you've forgotten, trust me, you haven't forgotten. You just can't access them right now in your current state of mind. I believe in a different state of mind, all that information is accessible to you. Just FYI. Okay, so that's, I think, let me see here. I guess I would say, let's talk about dream awareness for a minute. In the hypnagogic and hypnopompic states, those are the states just after being awake and just before becoming awake again, your awareness is very high. It's almost the same awareness as you have during normal waking life. But awareness is like a dimmer knob. You can turn that awareness down and you can turn it back up again. And so you'll find that as you go from hypnagogic down into deep sleep, your awareness goes right almost just to zero, really. And then when you're coming back up into REM, your awareness it varies. Now, it may sound strange. You could say, some people believe that when they're asleep, they have no awareness. And I guess it all depends on what the definition of awareness is to you. Here's what I mean. When you're asleep, most of the time, you don't realize you're asleep, right? You're playing in a baseball game with your friends, or you're flying a spaceship, or you're being chased by a monster. But you're not saying, "Oh, I'm asleep and I'm being chased by a monster." You're saying, "I'm being chased by a monster. I'm going to get killed, and I'm scared." Right? That's what happens. But the monster example is a tough one. But let's just say you're dreaming that you're in your third grade classroom and you're talking to your friend. Obviously, you're aware, or you wouldn't be able to have a conversation, right? So you've got to have some mental acuity to be able to carry on a conversation and respond to what they're saying. You're not just sitting there watching passively yourself talking to your friend. You are actually yourself actually talking to your friend. So you have to have some mental faculties to do that, all right? So don't confuse whether or not you are aware in that dream with the fact that whether you were aware that you were dreaming. Those are two different things, okay? So yes, in most dreams, you've got a reasonably high level of awareness. Very often, you've got the same level of awareness as you do now, sitting here in the real world. Now, there's another aspect of this, however, though, is that there's an aspect of your consciousness that kind of questions things, right? So when you're in your dream and you're talking to your friend and something totally bizarre happens, you would think that if you were completely aware, you'd be able to recognize that something bizarre just happened, right? An elephant just flew by. Well, if I'm aware, I should know that the elephant can't fly by and that I must be asleep. Well, we're going to talk a little bit about that sort of thing, and that's one way to recognize that you're dreaming and to become lucid in your dream. But being aware and having a good level of discernment, those are subtly different things. Being aware enough to have a conversation with your friend and aware enough to have a conversation going on in your head while you're talking with your friend. Maybe your friend says your fly is down, and in your mind going, "Oh, I'm really embarrassed. I don't know what to say. I'm gonna crack a joke with my friend because I'm embarrassed." Right? You can actually have these sort of subtexts and sub conversations going on in your mind while you're having a conversation with your friend while you're asleep. Right? I don't know if any of you can even remember those kinds of things going on in your dreams, but I can tell you from personal experience, I'm very good at remembering dreams at this point. It absolutely goes on. So this idea where you can have an internal dialogue at the same time as having an external dialogue at the same time as sleeping, absolutely possible. But I will say, one's sense of discernment is very often pretty degraded while sleeping. So some bizarre things can happen that when you're awake looking at them, you're going to say, "Boy, that was bizarre. Why didn't I just realize that I was dreaming?" I can't really answer that question. Somehow that little volume knob was turned way down while you're sleeping, is all I can say. Those are the phases of sleep, those are the cycles of sleep, and those are some of the mechanisms behind it.